Hey folks, welcome to a portfolio review at Finominal. Today we're going to look at Invesco Strategic Active 100 portfolio, which provides exposure to global equities, specifically to US, international, and emerging market stocks. If you look at their holdings, we do see that there are 7 mutual funds from Invesco, and the 3 that dominate are the Invesco Diversified Dividend Fund, Invesco Main Street Fund, Invesco Discover Large Cap Fund, and each of those has about 21% from an exposure perspective. Now, if you look at the suggested benchmark, then we see the MSCI World Index. So this is the benchmark that we come up with if you look at this current portfolio. And indeed, if we do look at the performance of this portfolio going back, it pretty much tracks the MSCI World Index. There's very little differentiation. Having said that, this is the performance of this portfolio, not the track record of the strategy. And for that, we would need to have the historic holdings, which are not available, but we can have a look at the fact sheet. And if you do look at the fact sheet, we do need to scroll to page 3, which is usually not a good sign for performance data. And what we do see here is the performance of this portfolio versus the index that Invesco defines. And effectively, we can see since inception in 2018, this portfolio would have generated 4.4% per annum compared to 9.8% for the benchmark. Stated differently, if you look at the actual track record of the strategy, it brutally underperformed its benchmark. And that's not great. Moving back and moving forward, right? So effectively, we're just looking at the current portfolio, and let's see in terms of what's been driving that from a risk and return perspective, and if it can be simplified, if fees can be reduced, and so on. So if you look at this portfolio, like as of today, we do see it's a pure equities portfolio, right? So the beta to the S&P 500 is consistent and positive. We do see there's no real consistent exposure to any kind of factor. Perhaps you could argue there's a more consistent exposure to the size factor and perhaps value to a degree, but it's pretty much around 0. And we also see that this is reflected in the resources, where effectively the exposure to the stock market, i.e. in the S&P 500 in that case, dominates. So the kind of tilts that were given this portfolio via different mutual funds, they don't really matter so much from risk perspective. While talking about risk, we can also look at this portfolio in terms of breakdown by market cap. We can see it's largely large cap stocks. So the mid and small caps those hardly matter. And from a geographic perspective, it's dominated by the United States, with the 67% of the stocks being US companies. And that, of course, again, mirrors kind of the MSCI World Index, right, which is largely large cap stocks from the US. Now, is this portfolio soundly constructed? Often what we find out that if you combine various funds, what happens in portfolios is that they kind of offset themselves from an exposure perspective. There's less of this in this portfolio. So we can, for example, move over here and look at the betas, the value factor, size factor, momentum factor of the underlying holdings. And there is slight tilts towards value and size, for example, from the dividend fund and so on, right? But there's not that much factor netting going on. So that's kind of fine. Could you improve this portfolio? Yes, you could. For example, in here, you do have funds that provide exposure to the value factor, but then you also have things like growth funds and so on that mitigate that. But factor netting is going on to a lower degree. Could you reduce the fees of this portfolio? We can have a look at that as well. So over here we see the 7 different Invesco funds, and you do see, let's actually look at passive benchmarks, and you do see that for each of them, we could effectively replace them with an ETF, right? So for example, the Invesco Main Street Fund, right? You could replace that simply with the S&P 500 and reduce cost, because that Main Street Fund is going to cost you 57 basis points versus the S&P 500 via this IVV ETF costs you 3 basis points. And if you would replace all of the mutual funds with low-cost ETFs, you would effectively reduce the fees from 72 basis points, which is expensive, to 6 basis points. And if you look at the current portfolio, you would actually, would have actually achieved a higher return. So what's not to like? Could you simplify this portfolio? Yes. In this case, it is indeed quite simple because, as we saw earlier, right, the kind of like this current portfolio is almost indistinguishable from the MSCI World Index. So instead of like buying this portfolio, right, and paying 72 basis points, you can simply buy the iShares, MSCI World ETF for 24 basis points, right? And you pretty much get the same exposures. And so this kind of concludes our analysis of Invesco Strategic Active 100 portfolio. From our perspective, there's not a lot of differentiation here, right? As you can see, it pretty much tracks the MSCI World Index. And given that, there is no reason to pay 72 basis points if it's not a differential portfolio that offers something unique, because you can simply replace that with one fund or replace expensive mutual funds with cheaper ETFs. Hope that helps. Have a nice day.